Okay. A study of the parables of Jesus. Lesson 15. We're going to take two parables today in this lesson because, as you will see, there's a connection between the two, both historically and content-wise. We'll take the parable of the rich fool from Luke 12, verses 13 through 21, and the parable of the unfruitful fig tree from Luke 13, verses 6 through 13. I'll give you a moment to locate Luke 12 in your testaments. Jesus was preaching to a group of people, and as often happened in his method of teaching outdoors and to groups of people, the people in the crowd reserved the right to ask him questions, either about what he was teaching or about what was on their minds. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." You can just see this person. It's been eating their heart out that his brother is not dealing fairly with him and cutting him out of some of his inheritance that was his by law. Jesus replied, "Man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" Then he said to them, turning to the crowd, "Watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed." Now, I would like to just interpolate something here that was not in my original notes for this lesson. Greed is something that we American believers need to really examine ourselves regularly to see if it is greed that is motivating our lives, the way we live. Because we live in a capitalistic society that frankly avows that it's based on greed. Biblically, however, even the simple desire to be rich, Paul tells us in 1 Timothy 6, is a sin that he tells Timothy, be sure to warn people against. And so I'm not talking either economics or politics. I'm talking biblical teaching. Be on your guard, lest greed be your motivation. A man's life, I'm continuing the quotation of Jesus now, a man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. You know, that's a passage that we've read, most of us, many times, or heard read, and we don't stop and think about how contrary that is to the world we live in. We rate people on how much wealth they have. We'll say, how are you doing? Oh, I've got a good job. I've got money in the bank. And we count them as successful. But Jesus does not. He does not count people's value depending on the amount of possessions they have. And then he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself, but is not rich toward God. Let's look at the background of this parable. First, there is the literary setting in which Luke places it. Jesus was teaching a large crowd of his disciples concerning a variety of subjects. But at least one of the people in the crowd wasn't paying attention to what he was saying. And instead, he was nursing a grudge against his brother. Suddenly, he blurted out a totally irrelevant exclamation. Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. Luke 12:13, my translation. Jesus' response made it clear that his work didn't include making and enforcing economic decisions. He said, who made me a judge or arbiter over you? Again, my translation. Then he introduced the parable with these words. Always watch out for greed in yourself and be on guard against it, because a person's life doesn't depend on the amount of possessions they have. Again, my translation. Now there's a historical background that Jesus shared with his hearers. The life of a farmer in Palestine at that time was always a precarious affair. Remember, they lived right on the edge of a desert. And think of the Great Valley in California, where the desert is on one side and plenty of rainfall is on the other. There were many. They were at the mercy of the early spring rains and the late summer or early fall rains. If the spring rains came at the right time, and then the rain ceased and the crop could grow, and then the fall rains set the fruit, the crop, then they had more than they could use. But if either one of those rains failed, they failed. This farmer had a year where both of the rains came exactly at the right time. And so his problem was, what was he going to do with the surplus? Now let's look at the meaning of the parable as a whole. Jesus tells us in his own words what the parable means. When he introduces the parable, the key phrase is this: a person's life doesn't depend on the amount of possessions they have. If you don't get anything else out of this parable, if you don't remember a single word of it, just remember that. Your life does not depend, the quality of it, on the your possessions. To emphasize this point, he closes the parable by saying, this is what will happen to the person who hoards up things for themselves and is not rich in the things of God. My translation. Now let's look at the meaning of the individual elements of this parable. This is one of the parables where we must be careful not to force meaning on individual elements, which Jesus included only as plot elements. The only elements which are significant are the following, which brings out the stark realism of the story. The extremely rich farmer is anyone whose life is motivated by greed. God, of course, is himself. Death is itself. I wanted to bring out the starkness of it. You've got greedy man, just God, inexorable death. You can't get any more stark than that. So we will go straight to making the parable your own. This parable, as I've tried to emphasize, both in the introduction and in the treatment of it, is very relevant to our present situation. Here and now, because greed is the basis of all human economic systems. I want to get that in, lest I be accused of being specifically anti-capitalistic. All economic systems, from capitalism to communism, it's only what they're greedy for and who is greedy. This means that believers in every nation will be confronted with the dilemma which confronts our rich farmer. Anxiety concerning our economic and physical well-being only makes the choices more difficult. This means that we all must watch for greed in everything we do or think. After praying for guidance, make a list of the ways in which greed, which is the desire to be rich, impacts your life and decision. Select one or more related items and commit yourself to eliminating them from your life. Need to warn you here, this will be a never-ending process. Yet you will always need to pray for guidance and forgiveness so that anxious guilt doesn't take away your spiritual joy and you grow worse instead of better. Now, let's turn to the parable of the unfruitful fig tree. That's in Luke. Let's get it right here. Beginning in verse 6. Then he told this parable. A man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he went to look for fruit on it, but he did not find any. So he said to the man who took care of the vineyard, "For 3 years now, I've been coming to look for fruit on this fig tree and haven't found any. Cut it down. Why should it use up the soil?" "Sir," the man replied, "leave it alone for 1 more year, and I'll dig around it and fertilize it. If it bears fruit next year, fine. If not, I will cut it down. This is a simple parable and primarily relevant to the generation of Jews alive during the ministry of Jesus. However, it will be relevant to us during the interval, whether long or short, between the ascension of Jesus and his return to judge the world. We will consider both of these aspects. Look at the background of the parable. First, the literary setting. This parable is spoken in the context of some Jewish tattletelling about unexpected calamities that happened to some of their contemporaries. Their tone demonstrates that they believed in the same ideas as those of Job's friends. The idea that a person who suffers unexpected calamity is revealed by that calamity to be a great hidden sinner whom God is publicly punishing. Jesus tells them they are completely mistaken in that belief, and that their belief is self-deceiving. For they are as great a hidden sinners as those upon whom the calamities fell. And then he told them this simple parable. The historical background. One of Luke's purposes in writing his gospel is to emphasize Jesus' warning to the Jewish religious and political leaders that if they didn't change their ways, the Gentiles would come and destroy their nation. He alone records this particular parable as part of that emphasis. The meaning of the parable as a whole. All the covenant people of God will be judged by the fruitfulness of their lives. I want to emphasize that. All the covenant people of God. No exceptions. No passes. Nobody gets in free. We will all be judged by the fruitfulness of our lives. The only way to maintain the proper relationship is to be constantly aware of one's own sinfulness, then confessing it and constantly trying to live a different kind of life. The time one has to repent is limited by personal and/or historical circumstances. The meaning of the individual elements of this parable. The vineyard owner, of course, is God. The vineyard is the covenant people of God, which at that time were the Jews. Today, both Jews and Gentiles. The vineyard worker is possibly Jesus himself. However, something about the man's role in the parable doesn't ring true to me, but I could be wrong there. The short time before the unfruitful tree would be cut down is the historically brief time before the destruction of the nation by the Romans. We need to note the irony of Jesus' question directed at the Jewish leaders. Why should it waste good soil? my translation. That's a place where the King James translation is very excellent. Why should it encumber the ground? In the context, Jesus is saying, why should God leave you unfruitful religious and political leaders to own the earth? All you're doing is taking up other people's space. Good question. Making this parable of your own, as we've noted above, this parable was directed primarily to the Jews and to their religious and political leaders. However, there is a cautionary element in it which is relevant to all of God's covenant people. We've seen that many of the parables teach us to be ready at all times and in all circumstances for his return in judgment. This parable should be included in that category. To make this parable your own, you should review and renew your commitment to be ready for his return. Also, remember, keep praying for his return. Thank you.